Look, I'm gonna be straight with you about something that's been eating at me for weeks now. We all saw what happened with Aaron Rodgers on that sideline. Everyone's talking about it, everyone's got an opinion, but nobody's really asking the question that matters. And honestly, after watching this game unfold the way it did, I don't think we can ignore it anymore. So here's what went down. Fourth quarter, Jets are trailing. The energy in that stadium is absolutely suffocating. You've got 70,000 people holding their breath, and Rodgers is standing there like he's got ice in his veins. But then something happens that nobody expected. He reaches into his pocket, pulls out what looks like a small capsule, breaks it open, and takes the deepest inhale you've ever seen a human being take. His eyes go wide, his head snaps back. For a second, it looks like he's been electrocuted. Then he blinks, shakes his head once, and walks onto that field like a completely different person. 3 plays later, he throws a bomb. 68 yards. Perfect spiral. Hits Pat Freiermuth in stride like they've been practicing that exact route for a decade. Touchdown. Game over. The place goes absolutely insane. But while everyone's celebrating, there's this weird tension building because we all know what we just saw. We all know what that was. And we all know it's not supposed to be happening anymore. Now, before you start typing angry comments, let me tell you why this matters more than you think. Because this isn't just about one play or one player or even one game. This is about a decision the league made earlier this year that nobody really understood at the time, but now we're seeing the consequences play out in real time. The NFL banned smelling salts completely. No distribution during games, no exceptions, no loopholes. They cited FDA concerns about neurological effects and player safety. Sounds reasonable on paper, right? Except the players lost their minds over it. George Kittle, the tight end from San Francisco, literally hijacked a live NFL Network interview to rant about how stupid the rule was. He said it was part of the game, part of the culture, part of what gets guys ready to go out there and hit each other at full speed for 3 hours. And he's not wrong. Walk into any NFL locker room over the past 30 years and you'd find boxes of ammonia inhalants sitting right next to the tape and the Gatorade. It's been that normal, that accepted, that ingrained in the ritual of game day. But here's where it gets complicated. The stuff works. Like, it really works. Ammonia triggers this immediate response in your body where your breathing rate spikes, your heart rate jumps, and you get this massive surge of alertness. It's basically a neurological alarm clock that screams at your brain to wake up right now. For players dealing with fatigue, pain, or just the mental fog that comes with getting hit repeatedly, it's been a lifesaver. Literally, for some guys, they swear by it. They say without it, they can't get to that edge they need to perform at the highest level. So why ban it? Well, the FDA has been raising red flags about ammonia exposure for years. Studies suggest that repeated inhalation can cause respiratory irritation, tissue damage, and potentially long-term neurological effects. There's also concern that players are using it to push through injuries they shouldn't be playing through in the first place. The league decided that the risk wasn't worth it anymore and implemented the ban at the start of the season. Teams couldn't provide it, medical staff couldn't distribute it, players were told to find other ways to get hyped. Except that didn't really happen, because what we saw with Rodgers proves that the rule is basically unenforceable. He brought his own. He used it on the sideline in front of cameras, coaches, officials, and 70,000 fans. And nobody stopped him. Nobody fined him. Nobody even mentioned it officially afterward. The league stayed silent. The Jets stayed silent. And Rodgers just kept playing like nothing happened. Which makes you wonder, what's the point of the rule if nobody's going to enforce it? Now let's talk about what happened after that throw. The Jets won that game, obviously, but the conversation didn't end there. Social media exploded. Former players started weighing in. Some said Rodgers was a legend for doing what needed to be done. Others said he was being reckless and setting a bad example for younger players who might not understand the risks. There were debates on every sports show, every podcast, every corner of the internet where football gets discussed, and the divide was pretty clear. Older players and fans tended to side with Rodgers. Younger voices and medical professionals lean towards supporting the ban. But here's the thing nobody's really talking about. Aaron Rodgers is 41 years old. At that age, your body doesn't respond the same way it used to. Recovery takes longer. Fatigue sets in faster. The mental sharpness that made you elite starts to fade just a little bit every year. So when a guy like that reaches for something to give him an edge, you have to ask yourself if it's desperation or just smart veteran play. Is he trying to extend his career by any means necessary? Or is he genuinely putting himself at risk for a game that's already taken so much from him? And that's where the ethics get messy, because if we're being honest, the NFL has never really been consistent about player safety. They banned smelling salts? Sure, but they still let guys play on short weeks. They still schedule Thursday night games where players are barely recovered from Sunday. They still have artificial turf in half the stadiums, even though everyone knows it causes more injuries than grass. They still put 300-pound men on collision courses with each other 40 times a game and act surprised when brains get damaged. So when the league suddenly decides that smelling salts are the line they won't cross, it feels less like genuine concern and more like liability management. The players see through it. That's why Kittle was so angry. That's why Rodgers didn't hesitate to break the rule. They know the league doesn't actually care about their long-term health as much as it cares about avoiding lawsuits and bad press. And when you're out there risking everything every single week, being told you can't use something that helps you perform feels insulting, especially when that same league is pushing you to play more games, take more hits, and extend seasons for more revenue. So what's the solution here? Honestly, I don't think there is one that makes everyone happy. You could argue that players should have full autonomy over their bodies and the choices they make. These are grown men who understand the risks and should be allowed to decide for themselves what they use to prepare for games. That's the libertarian view. Let them do what they want and deal with the consequences. Or you could say that the league has a responsibility to protect players from themselves, especially when it comes to substances that might cause long-term harm. That's the paternalistic view. Players can't always see the bigger picture in the heat of the moment, so rules need to exist to keep them safe, even if they don't like it. Both arguments have merit, both have flaws, but what doesn't work is what we have right now. A rule that exists on paper but gets ignored in practice. That's the worst possible outcome because it creates confusion, inconsistency, and resentment. Players don't know what's actually allowed, teams don't know what they're supposed to enforce, and fans are left watching guys break rules on live television with zero consequences. It makes the whole thing feel arbitrary and pointless. What makes this even more interesting is that Rodgers isn't just any player. He's one of the most vocal, controversial, and polarizing figures in the sport. He questions everything. He challenges authority. He's been at the center of vaccine debates, media criticism, and front office drama for years. So when he's the one breaking this rule, it becomes less about smelling salts and more about rebellion. It's Rodgers doing what Rodgers does, pushing boundaries, testing limits, refusing to fall in line just because someone told him to. And you know what? That's part of why people love him or hate him, depending on which side you're on. Because love him or not, you can't deny that he plays the game on his own terms. He doesn't apologize for who he is or what he believes. And when he makes a play like that 68-yard touchdown pass right after hitting the smelling salts, it reinforces this image of him as someone who operates outside the normal rules and still finds a way to win. But it also raises questions about what happens next. If Rodgers can get away with it, why can't everyone else? Do younger players start doing the same thing because they saw a future Hall of Famer do it without consequence? Do teams start quietly providing it again because they know the league isn't going to crack down? Does the ban just quietly disappear because nobody wants to deal with the backlash of actually enforcing it? These are real possibilities, and if that happens, the whole thing becomes a joke. The other side of this is the generational divide. Older players grew up in an era where toughness was everything. You played through pain. You used whatever you needed to get back on the field. Nobody questioned it because that's just what football was. But younger players are coming up in a different world. They're more educated about concussions, CTE, and long-term health effects. They're more willing to prioritize their bodies over the game. And they're watching guys like Rodgers and wondering if that old school mentality is something to admire or something to avoid. It's a fascinating cultural shift happening in real time, and the smelling salts debate is just one small example of it. The game is changing, the players are changing, the expectations are changing, but the league is stuck in this weird middle ground where they want to appear progressive and safety conscious while still maintaining the violent high-intensity product that makes them billions of dollars. You can't have it both ways. Eventually something's going to break. So here's where we are. Aaron Rodgers used smelling salts on national television, threw a perfect touchdown pass, and nobody did anything about it. The rule still exists. Players still hate it. The league still won't enforce it. And we're all left wondering what the point of any of this is. Because if the goal was to make the game safer, this rule failed. If the goal was to set a standard, it failed. If the goal was to protect players from themselves, it definitely failed. All it did was create confusion and prove that the NFL's decision-making process is as inconsistent as ever. And maybe that's the real story here. Not that Rodgers broke a rule, not that smelling salts are dangerous or harmless, but that the league doesn't actually know what it wants. It reacts to pressure without thinking through the consequences. It implements rules without considering how they'll be enforced. It tries to manage perception instead of solving problems. And players like Rodgers expose that dysfunction every single time they step out of line. Which brings me back to that moment on the sideline. Rodgers standing there, capsule in hand, knowing full well what he's about to do is against the rules. And doing it anyway, because in his mind, the rule is stupid, the ban is pointless, and if he needs that edge to make the throw, he's gonna take it regardless of what the league says. That's the mentality of a guy who's been at the top for 2 decades and doesn't answer to anyone except himself. But it's also the mentality that makes this sport so chaotic, because when individual players start deciding which rules matter and which ones don't, the whole system falls apart. And if the league doesn't have the spine to enforce its own policies, then what's stopping everyone else from doing the same thing? You end up with a free-for-all where the only rule is don't get caught, or if you do get caught, just be famous enough that nobody cares. That's not sustainable. That's not fair. And it's definitely not the kind of precedent you want to set when you're trying to convince people that player safety is a priority. So something has to change. Either the league needs to enforce the ban and deal with the backlash, or they need to admit it was a mistake and reverse it. What they can't do is keep pretending the rule exists while letting guys like Rodgers ignore it without consequences. That's the worst of both worlds. And look, I get why this is hard. The NFL is a business. They don't want to find their biggest stars. They don't want to create controversy during playoff season. They don't want to alienate fans who love the old school toughness mentality. But at some point, you have to stand for something. You have to draw a line and actually enforce it. Otherwise, the rules mean nothing and the whole thing becomes theater. So where does that leave us? With a 41-year-old quarterback who just threw one of the best passes of the season right after doing something he wasn't supposed to do. With a league that banned a substance but won't punish anyone for using it, with fans who are divided over whether this is a problem or not, and with the uncomfortable reality that football has always been a sport that exists in the gray area between discipline and chaos. Maybe that's what makes it great, or maybe that's what's gonna destroy it. Either way, we're all watching to see what happens next.